Hello and welcome to The Week That Really Was with John McGurk and Sarah Ryan for this week ending the 18th of July 2025. It is the middle of the summer. It is very wet and rainy in Tipperary where I am, but we're paying back the very good weather that we had last week. Sarah, how are you?
I'm fine. I miss the sunny weather. Went swimming in the sea for the weekend. It was fabulous.
Yes, for overseas listeners, it's important to note that in Ireland it is mandatory to start every conversation with a discussion about the weather for the previous week because we so rarely have nice weather. And it is back to being wet and miserable here. We should also mention last week's podcast because there were a number of people, Sarah, who were very upset that this podcast, which normally features harmony and good humour between us, features so much argument and dissent. And people were a bit upset about that. Personally, I just think it was some of your fans didn't like watching you lose an argument, but, they'll
Well,
get
it's just
over
so
it, I guess.
rare. It's just so rare for them.
Can't believe you just conceded that one. You just gave me that one. I think many people in fairness did not think that you lost the argument, but it's important to note that on this podcast we occasionally have robust exchanges of views where they are warranted, and being able to do so in a healthy and constructive way while maintaining your friendship with somebody is a really important life skill for everybody. And that was the most patronizing thing I've ever said on this show. I've just realized. Anyway, we'll get on to this week, where we're hopefully not going to fight as much. We're going to talk about a couple of topics that I think are important. We're going to start by chatting about the presidential election. Might be the only people in Ireland who are actually interested in this thing, but we'll talk about it anyway. We're going to talk a little bit about, later on in the podcast, about something that I wrote about this week that people, I think it resonated with a lot of people, which is the whole fandango around the excavation of the graves in Tuam and the myths that persist in relation to that issue, because they are, I think, quite serious, quite pervasive, and say a lot about our culture. And we're also going to have a little conversation about the state of the nation and something I've taken to referring to as Mrs. Jellybee's Ireland and what that means. But we will start off, Sarah, with the presidential election because there were a couple of newsworthy developments this week. First of all, Catherine Connolly, the independent left-wing socialist, in fairness, and that's not a slur, she just is a socialist TD from Galway West, announced her candidacy. She very clearly has the support to get on the ballot paper with the backing of a lot of left-wing parties, and indeed a surprise addition we'll shortly discuss. Mairead McGuinness secured the Fine Gael nomination. She will be their candidate in the election. So that's at least two people confirmed on the ballot paper, while there are rumours and more rumours of more people trying to get on the ballot behind the scenes. So I'll kick over to you. How do you think things stand at the moment? What was the biggest news story in relation to the presidency this week for you?
Well, I mean, I'll let you, because you wrote an article about one of the stories relating to the presidential election this week, so I'll let you touch on that in a second. I think Catherine Connolly entering the race is not exactly a big surprise. And Mairead McGuinness, not a surprise either. But I mean, overall, I would say that it's still very much in the realm of boring. Pale and stale and all that. I'm sure Catherine Connolly is a nice person. I don't really know much about her as a candidate, to be honest. But she seems to, she's obviously going to get the nomination. She's getting the backing of a lot of the obvious people and then sometimes the not obvious people. But I still remain of the view that it's thus far quite a depressing lineup, and that there's nothing really interesting happening. I saw Catherine Connolly saying that everything and nothing at her press conference about what the role of the president should be and how wonderful Michael D. Higgins is. And I mean, for me, that's despite what any socialist party or any party that's backing her will say. That's just, to me, continuity candidate, more of the same. Somebody who'll read poems and talk shite, and that's not my jam, and that's not what I think the last election we're probably going to have to send a message or have conversations about things that we want to talk about for 5 years should be about.
Well, I wouldn't. I'll say this, I would not underestimate the appeal of a continuity candidacy. I mean, people get annoyed with me when I say things like this, but I will say it anyway. I mean, Michael D. Higgins in many ways is the ideal president for modern Ireland. I mean, I don't like him. I didn't vote for him on either occasion. I would never vote for him if he could run for a third term, and I won't be voting for Catherine Connolly. But the only time that this country has ever actually elected a socialist to a position of supreme influence is when all they have is influence without power. I mean, Michael D is the perfect candidate for the kind of the Irish voter out there who likes to think of themselves as nice and liberal and left wing, particularly on the national stage and a little bit international stage, as you say, and a little bit more moral than everybody else in the world, but doesn't actually want to live with the policy consequences of socialism. So they elect their little socialist. So I didn't mean little as a dig at Michael D there, genuinely, but they elect their socialist president, and they have him write his poems, and they have him, give his lectures on how things should be at various poetry retreats and at the UN and what have you. And they hope that he makes the rest of the world a better place. He's kind of like our gift to the rest of the world. Look at our wonderful little president telling you all how to be better people. But they don't have to live with his mantra at home. So they would never actually elect a government of Michael D. Higgins to implement his preferred tax rates, to enact his particular version of freedom, to perpetrate his ideas into the schools for their children to learn. They would never do that. So in some ways, the presidency is an escape valve for the new modern Irish conscience. And Michael D's. I think that's the campaign that Catherine Connolly will run. She will run a campaign where she will go out and she will promise to be the person who tells the world how much better things would be if they would only listen to the Irish people. And that is very appealing to the Irish egos. I wouldn't write her off. And maybe that's what's attracted apparently newfound socialist Michael Collins of Independent Ireland to desire to back her so heavily. Because as you alluded to earlier on, I wrote a story this week which was very well sourced, though I say so myself, which is that Independent Ireland's Michael Collins desperately wanted, earlier in the week, Independent Ireland's 4 TDs to nominate socialist candidate Catherine Connolly for the presidency. Apparently, I'm told, on the basis that it was his view that Independent Ireland would be very well positioned to win the by-election should she accede to the presidency. And to say that this was met with confusion and disbelief among some of his colleagues would be an understatement, because some of them, I'm not naming any names here, some of them were of the view that perhaps their party might be in a position to facilitate a wider discussion during the presidential election. And even if a candidate from, say, the Peter Casey, Nick Delahanty, there's rumours about Declan Ganley, as I alluded to on this podcast a couple of weeks ago, even if somebody from that stable was in the election, it might facilitate a wider conversation that might benefit them more in the long run. But that is not apparently how Michael Collins saw it. And I think that demonstrates, above anything else, not to underestimate Catherine Connolly, because she is able to draw support from various sides of the spectrum.
Well, I think what you're describing there is somebody who is, Catherine Connolly is going to get the nomination whether Independent Ireland back her or not. And so I think that in order to try and stay true and honest to the base of a lot of the Independent Ireland voters, I think he would have been wiser to stay out of it, because that by-election will be happening regardless. I don't.
Well, only if she wins, but I take your point, yeah.
But she whether she wins or not, she'll win or not, she'll get the nomination. That's the only thing they're participating in. And after that, she'll win if she wins, and she'll lose if she loses. And the by-election will be happening regardless, without alienating a lot of the people who voted for Independent Ireland on the basis that they thought that they stood for something completely different from what Catherine Connolly does. But on that, to go back to my point, and we were kind of talking about this off air earlier on, it is the last election for 5 years, and I noticed Nick Delahanty was putting out a lot of stuff this week, and Nick Delahanty is obviously looking for a nomination to run himself.
I had a video of you praising him.
You were in it as well, John. But I think that the point that people miss about somebody like Nick or another candidate who runs is that if we go back a few years ago when COVID started, I noticed, and I'm sure you're the same, and there's lots of people who listen to the podcast who've approached both of us in the street and spoken to us about Gript and about different things, that there's a huge constituency of people in Ireland that before COVID didn't really care that much about politics within reason, weren't really affected by it, paid their taxes, had their job, went on holidays, whatever. And then during COVID, they saw that for the first time ever in their adult lives, or probably in their entire lives, the arm of the state reached into their life and started to mess with their life, telling them that they couldn't go here, they couldn't do that, they had to get this injection, or they weren't allowed to go to a restaurant, etc., etc. And for a lot of people, not only did they not like the arm coming in and messing with their life, but they didn't like the look of the arm that they'd elected previously to do so. And so now they're more engaged with politics, and they're more, I was going to say radicalized, but they're just more engaged with the political system in general, and they want different things from it, and they vote differently than they used to. And we see a growing discontent with the government, notwithstanding that the government got re-elected in the last general election, but there's certainly a growth amongst the Irish public, a growth of dissatisfaction, we'll say, with the political establishment. We know from the general election and the local and European elections that growth is there, but it's not big enough yet to elect people. And it's probably, let's be honest, not big enough yet to elect a president, which is a one-seat election, okay? This is an election for the establishment parties, and they will work together to elect the most, whichever amongst them is elected by the transfers of the other. We all probably know that, notwithstanding that there could be some huge shock or whatever. But I think what people need to come to terms with, and this was evident in Niall Boylan's campaign in Europe and other elections, that sometimes it's still really important to not allow the establishment parties a free run at an election where they collude together to decide what the things that will be discussed in that election campaign are. And so in the European elections or whatever, somebody like Niall Boylan doesn't get elected, but forces Labour and Fianna Fáil to engage with the concept of immigration during that election campaign. And this presidential election should be no different. Nick Delahanty or whoever it might be, maybe they won't get elected, John, but they should be there because it's really important for our maturity as voters, our discourse, everything, that Labour and Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin and the continuity candidate from socialism that's backed by everybody, including Independent Ireland, don't all just sit around and decide we're all going to... You saw it in the debates in the European elections, the likes of Niall Boylan aren't even allowed onto the debate. And they go through the panel and they all have the same view on most of...
I'm just going to cut across you there because I know you were talking in hypothetical terms, but I just want to make absolutely clear here that what I reported is that they were giving very strong consideration to backing her, not that they're actually backing her. No decisions were made on that front.
Okay, but regardless, enough of the left-leaning parties are going to back Catherine Connolly, and she is going to be nominated, notwithstanding whether or not Independent Ireland do anything or not. But the point is, John, that there's a huge amount of agreement, despite the fact that Fine Gael will be described by their opponents as right-wing and left-wing, whatever. There'll be a huge amount of agreement on a lot of the main issues amongst those parties, and they will have debates and they will talk about the things they want to talk about. And the best thing for politics, the best thing to get things talked about is to have a couple of alternative candidates. And I think the system will do everything it can to block those people from entering. And that's why, more than anything else, I would have an issue with the likes of Independent Ireland if they were to back somebody like Catherine Connolly, who doesn't need their votes anyway, because she's going to get the nomination. Why wouldn't they throw their weight behind somebody else and let somebody else in just to mix it up? Otherwise, you're just letting... I feel like the established parties are just going to get away with it again. It'll be just a load of people agreeing with each other and then tinkering around the edges with nonsense conversations about things that they know the president can't do, or tinkering around the edges about how to spend more money on the things they agree with, and pretending like the big problems that matter to a lot of people in Ireland don't exist.
Well, I agree with you. On a couple of levels. I'll come to the reasons why in our next topic, because I think what the big parties are terrified of is the thing about a presidential election is that there will be a maximum of, I think the biggest election we ever had was like 7 candidates on the ballot. And there will be one single debate. Once you're on the ballot, everyone who's nominated has a valid nomination. And it's a tough hurdle to clear. You either need the backing of 4 county councils or 20 members of the Oireachtas. Once you've got a presidential nomination, there is no doubt. RTE cannot say you don't have the support to get into the presidential debates on national television watched by the entire nation. And once you get into that debate, you've got the backing of either the 4 councils or the 20 TDs. You can stand on that stage and you can make big, dramatic, some will say controversial, I would say accurate, statements to the public about the state of the country that they live in that cannot be said and will not be said in the Dáil, or haven't been said in the Dáil. And they are utterly terrified of that happening. You can sense it. I mean, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, according to John Lee in the Daily Mail, have told their county councillors that they are not to nominate anyone for the presidency. So they're trying to lock off that 4 councils route, because that is how Peter Casey, for example, got on the ballot the last time. He then surged to 25% of the vote on foot of some comments about travellers. Now, I like Peter Casey. I think he's a good guy. I don't think he's the greatest communicator in the world, and I think somebody who's a better communicator, who could have capitalized on the momentum he gained from simply standing up and saying something that most people instinctively know to be true, but he was attacked for saying it. He's got 25% of the vote. I think somebody who's able to deliver that message in a, I don't mean to be patronizing, but slightly more refined way, might have done even better. And I think they are instinctively terrified of that. So they want to keep that option off the ballot paper. And that is why I was also surprised, I have to say. It is not for me to comment as the editor of a media platform on the morality or anything else of decisions political parties make, but as a strategic matter. I have to say, as somebody who's interested in politics and watched it, when somebody called me up and said, Michael Collins wants to back Catherine Connolly, I was like, no, I'm not going, you're having me on. And then I confirmed it with a couple of other people. And it was just astonishing to me on a purely strategic level that was being considered. Now, in fairness, people sometimes have ideas, then they reverse course. Maybe they think about it, and maybe it's unfair to Michael for me to have published that while he was in the midst of having just an open conversation. But I think he alluded to it on radio, so I think it's also then fair to comment on it.
Yeah.
But I thought it was a strange decision. But look, I think with the presidential election, we didn't talk about Mairead McGuinness. I think she has to be considered the front runner to actually win the thing. And I'm going to say something now that is going to make me unpopular with the listeners for a change. I wouldn't have a massive problem with it. I'm not endorsing Mairead McGuinness as a human being, not endorsing every aspect of her career. I think she's got serious questions to answer about her expenses arrangements, which is in the European Parliament. But I think if you look at what the job of president was designed to be, which was basically to be a rubber stamp in the Phoenix Park, who didn't open their mouth and embarrass the country or step outside the realms of the office, I think she would probably go to Áras Nuachtáin, and people can come back and mock me about this in a couple of years if I'm wrong and she wins. She'd probably go to Áras Nuachtáin and stay relatively quiet and shake the hand she's supposed to shake and generally represent the country in a dignified way, which is all I think you can ask for a president. She wouldn't be my first choice for the job. I'm not endorsing her. I want to be absolutely clear with that. But I think that's why she should also probably be considered the overwhelming favourite, because I think a lot of preferences will flow towards her on that basis, and I think she'll do solidly on the first count. But we'll see who else emerges. As I said, I know Peter Casey has confirmed he's seeking a nomination through the county councils. He's been quite quiet about that so far. There have been persistent rumours about my old friend Declan Ganley. Whether they are true or not, I don't know. There have been rumours Nick Delahanty is openly seeking a nomination. I still do think Nick will find it very, very difficult to get one, I have to say. I think everyone will find it very, very difficult to get one. Unless you have the backing of Sinn Féin or Fianna Fáil, who are the two big players who haven't entered this one way or the other yet. I'll say one last thing on this, just from a pure punditry point of view. If I was looking at a choice of Mairead McGuinness and Catherine Connolly and everyone else finding it very difficult to get into the race, and I was sitting up in Drumcondra, and I was a retired former Taoiseach who had a bit of a common touch, and would inject a bit of controversy into the race, I'd be thinking my chances wouldn't be as bad as you thought,
I wonder who you're talking about.
I'm talking about Bertie Ahern. Yeah.
Obviously. Yeah. Well, I think it's I agree with you that I think that Mairead McGuinness is currently the front runner, but that's just because there's nobody else.
Fine Gael have done something very clever, by the way. Like it's so cynical, but it's really clever. And a lot of people might not have noticed this, which is that they announced that she would be her candidate. That she would be their candidate, but they haven't formally nominated her, so she's not a candidate. So they've simply announced that she's won the contest to be their nominee, but they're not actually going to formally nominate her until I think the beginning of September. So these next long 6 weeks of when there's no news and the media is bored and all they can do is kick around potential presidential candidates, she won't be out on the stump, she won't be campaigning, she'll be sitting quietly, she'll be hiding away, and she'll say, I'll announce and they'll talk about my campaign in September, and she'll avoid weeks and weeks of scrutiny because of that pretty clever decision by Fine Gael. I think that's something that's worth mentioning. just for people who want to know how politics works in this country and the way things happen. Like, that's what's happening there. They've announced she's her candidate, but they haven't formally nominated her, so she can avoid the next 6 weeks.
Yeah, but I mean, John, like, you're long enough in the tooth in politics, and so am I, to know that, like, why would you? I mean, August is silly season. It's the season of finding, to use our example that we've used before, that she ran over a hedgehog one time when she was getting her driving license when she was 17. It's the time to print, random stories about politicians. Why would you expose a candidate that's the front runner, that's got only can lose from those kind of stories? Of course, that's what you do.
All
She's
right.
benefiting from the fact that there's nobody else out there right now who is in a position to start making serious hay over the summer with momentum. She's benefiting. If that person existed, they wouldn't be doing that, because she'd have to come out and start fighting with that person, but she doesn't have to. So that, of course, they're going to do that.
All right. Okay. Well, we've done 20 minutes of presidential punditry, which, if you're still with us after that, you really are a fan, and we appreciate you. And I wanted to talk about some of the stuff in the news this week that I thought was not, I don't want to say more important, but I thought relevant. So, Sarah, I'm going to hit you with a couple of stories here. If you're at the Irish Independent this morning, we record this on Thursday, the 17th of July, you would have learned that 160,000 households in Ireland are in arrears on their electricity bills, with the average amount owed for a household being €476. So that's 160,000 households in Ireland behind, in arrears, trying to catch up with themselves on the electricity bill alone. €476 they owe. Earlier in the week, there were figures that came out that showed that an average weekly shop in Ireland is now 22% higher in 2025 over 2022. So over the last 3 years, the cost of an average weekly shop has increased by a quarter. If you were following the news in health, you would have heard this week that last year, Stephen Donnelly, when he was still Minister for Health, ordered that all of the 68 children who are due for scoliosis operations in Ireland would have their surgery funded overseas. Out of those 68 people who are desperately waiting for operations, 2 so far have been sent for operations. You'll know, if you're listening to this podcast, that Ireland has a housing crisis, and you may not have seen the story from Waterford. I loved the story from Waterford this week. I don't know if you saw it. Tim Healy from the Irish Independent, he told his readers this tale. There's a housing estate in Waterford that's been built, 28 houses built to the highest standards. The developer is in court to stop an order that has come through from the county council. The county council has sought an order that the brand new housing estate be demolished, all 28 homes, on the grounds that the houses have been built 3 to 4 metres above the elevation in the National Development Plan, which is considered to be a tremendous offence. And finally, I'll mention, without going too overboard on these, that the Irish League of Credit Unions did a survey which showed that 30% of parents are going to have to go into debt, they say, to fund back to school in a few weeks' time. And at the end of the week, we had an opinion poll which showed that 14% of the public think that the government is successfully tackling the country's problems, and 86% do not. So I just wanted to throw this all out in the context of the presidential election, because to me it is fascinating to watch how this country is being run. Because then when I looked at all those stories, Sarah, and I'm sorry, I know I'm going on a bit, but I do want to make the point. I looked at what the Taoiseach was doing for the week. So on Wednesday, he met with Agnes Calamard of Amnesty International to discuss ongoing human rights issues in the Gaza Strip and elsewhere. He met with Filippo Grandi, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, to discuss Ireland's continuing commitment to the plight of persons displaced by wars. And then on Tuesday, he ventured outside government buildings to issue an important statement on the war in Gaza, to announce that the Irish government was working tirelessly to stop it. He also attended a National Day of Commemoration for Irish soldiers who died overseas, in fairness to him. The Taoiseach opened his week. He met with the Brazilian foreign minister, in which he pledged 15 million of your and my euros to the Amazon Fund as a part of an effort to promote Brazil's climate leadership. So we're giving them 15 million quid. Then he went off to Brussels to focus on sanctions for Israel at European Union level. He lost on that. Then he announced our membership of CERN. And then he said he's been spending the rest of his week working tirelessly for a trade deal with the USA, which is, of course, a European Union competence and not a Simon Harris competence. So, I mean, am I going mad, or have these politicians lost their fucking minds when it comes to what their job actually is?
He said the F word. Way to keep on top of the diaries for starters. That's some commitment there, John. Fair play to you. No, I don't think you're going mad. This comes back to the point that we're making about the presidential election, that there is a massive disparity between what a lot, not all, but a lot of people feel the key issues, the things they want to hear about are, and what politicians are doing or want to be seen to be doing, if that makes sense. Who they think they are and what they are projecting as their image to the public and what they're actually doing. But people voted for this government. They voted them back in.
Yeah, I don't think it's as simple as that. I mean, because I don't know. You put yourself in the position of a voter in this country. I don't know what you're supposed to do. What are you supposed to do? I mean, you're supposed to say, well, that's it. I'm voting for the Irish Freedom Party. You don't have a TD. I mean, you've got to vote for somebody who's. I mean, no disrespect to the Irish Freedom Party. You don't have a TD or any immediately obvious prospect of getting one. You're going to vote for, I'm sorry, but I don't think Independent Ireland or Aontú, who are the kind of two sort of rightish leaning alternatives, are ready to form a government. And the left are worse on all this stuff. They're less interested in the cost of living and what's happening in the country than they are with. I mean, they're the ones actually driving all this international stuff. So I don't know. I mean, I was rereading during the week. I was reading Charles Dickens's Bleak House, and it came to me, that rant I just had, it just came to me because there's a character, for people who've never read that book, which you should. There's a character in it called Mrs. Jellyby, and it's set in the 1800s in the Victorian era. And Mrs. Jellyby is this woman who has like a family of children, and she's got a husband, but she's kind of middle class, and she spends all her time trying to raise money to help out children in the coffee farms in Africa and to develop trade links with Africa, all to help the poor people over in Africa. And the point in the novel is, as is constantly reinforced, her own home is falling down around her. Her children aren't educated. They're dirty. They're going without clothing. She doesn't listen to anybody else. She ignores all of her own responsibilities to focus on what's happening in another continent that she'll never even visit. And the point Dickens is making is not that, she's a salutary lesson in priorities. It's that she's literally insane. He's portraying her as insane. And it's not only insane. And this is what really pisses me off. These people take the moral high ground, Sarah, and they are deeply immoral. I'm sorry. It is immoral when your country has people in it who can't afford their own electricity bill, which in the Western world, okay, maybe electricity is a luxury in the Horn of Africa. I take that point. We're lucky to have it at all. I get that. But in the Western world, it's a functional necessity to exist. And we've got families in this country who can't afford it. We've got parents who need to send their kids to school who cannot send their kids to school. We've got people out there who can't get homes, and you've got agencies of the state proposing to knock them down. And you're spending your fucking time talking to Agnes Calamard of Amnesty International about third world human rights issues around the world. Do your jobs. This is what people talk to me when I talk about the Occupied Territories Bill and the waste of time of all that is. People get annoyed and say I'm pro-Israeli. No, I'm pro-Irish. I want a country that's politicians actually focus on the problems in this country. Do the things that they were elected to do. Make people's lives better. And what do we get? We get a pair of fucking prancing pricks. I'm actually losing my temper in a way I never should on this podcast. Going around the world trying to augment their books and bid an audition for a Nobel Peace Prize that is never going to come because the rest of the world can see through their bullshit. I'm going to stop now. I'm going to let you talk because I apologize to listeners who are offended by bad language. I don't normally get angry in this podcast, and I didn't mean to get angry when I was doing that. But as I started talking about it, genuinely the mercury started rising. So I'll just calm down and let you talk.
Well,
tell me something I said that was wrong. Disagree with me on something.
No, please. I don't disagree with you on anything. Well, I'd be afraid to, but it's lucky that I don't. I mean, it's about time that you got so upset, because when you mentioned the scoliosis thing, you will recall that was it a year ago or less, where I had a very similar rant and meltdown about that particular nugget of Irish shame. The children waiting for scoliosis operations that were never happening. And then around that time, there was a commitment made that they would go elsewhere. And as you just pointed out, only 2 did. And I think that Simon Harris should, given that he was the one, I mean, Stephen Donnelly has lost his seat, but Simon Harris was the one who made the promise originally. I'm just going to stick to the scoliosis thing. But that it's like that should be his number one priority, that he doesn't speak about anything else until that is fixed. Do you know what I mean? But instead, as you say, mincing around the world, talking about this, talking about that, and pretending, or I don't know. I mean, is it just as simple as that, talking about those big ideas around the world and being the best boy in the class, whether it's in Europe, and being morally better and, better and all of that around the world, is just easier than tackling hard problems that take time and effort and work at home? Is it as simple as that? Or is it something more sinister? Is it about do you honestly think that it is about self-promotion, that Micheál and Simon Harris want to your words, like, I mean, obviously they don't think they're going to get a Nobel Peace Prize, but like that it's about showing off and showboating to international communities that you're just such great people and wonderful, and that you just really genuinely care more about that than you do about problems at home? Or is it just that they're harder? What is
Firstly,
it?
just to reiterate my apology, because I know there's some listeners who do not like bad language, and I used more than my week's surfeit of it there a few minutes ago. I'm not going to do that again. What do I think it is? I think it is a deep moral confusion about what their job is. And I can't remember whether I alluded to this on this podcast a couple of weeks ago, and it actually relates to what we're going to talk about in a few minutes in relation to Tuam. But the general perspective of this country for years has been that everyone laboured under the yoke of the Catholic Church, and that the bishops wielded the crozier and performed and provided moral leadership, while the politicians administered the state and they did what the bishops said. And
Yep.
then the politicians got rid of the bishops. They kicked them out. They exposed their chicanery and their immorality and their hypocrisy and their paedophilia and all of those things, or their covering up of paedophilia, I should say. I don't think there was a paedophile bishop. I can be wrong, but I don't think there was. And now they've replaced the bishops.
Yeah.
Simon Harris does not see himself as a political leader. I mean, he knows he's a political leader. He knows that he has a political job. He knows that he's the leader of Fine Gael. But ultimately, he sees himself as a moral leader.
Yeah.
His job is not to improve the country. It is to teach us all how to be better people. And now that has gone, it is magnified. It was almost tolerable when he was just teaching us how to be better people. It was almost tolerable when it was, you need to like the gays more. You need to have more abortions. You need to, be nicer to trans people. All that stuff. It was almost tolerable because at least he was talking to us. Now he's transitioned into somebody who actually thinks he's a moral leader for the world. I mean, and Micheál Martin has always had those tendencies. Right? Micheál Martin has always had those kind of headmasterish tendencies of, I'm going to teach you all how to be better people, how to be a better Ireland, how to be, and he's also transitioning that into how to be a better world. I mean, the idea of Simon Harris, people think I focus on the Gaza stuff. The idea of Simon Harris handing over 15 million euros to Brazil to encourage their global climate leadership, to a country that cuts down 10,000 acres of rainforest in the Amazon a day, according to some estimates, it's just so utterly laughable. The Brazilians will take our money, run, and keep doing what they're doing. But Simon Harris gets to pose as a global influencer. I mean, it is a complete confusion of what their roles are. It's this idea that their job is to educate us in the way that priests and bishops used to, not to do the things that the government is supposed to do, which is to just make things work the way they're supposed to.
But
That's the only explanation I have, because the other explanation is immorality and malevolence.
Yeah,
And
but I mean, I think that's what you're touching on there is what's wrong with Ireland in general, which is that it's pervasive in universities and in workplaces and in politics and in our media, which is this: the most important thing about you is your moral position on a couple of key issues. And as long as you have the right position on a couple of those moral issues, then everybody knows that you're better than everybody, that you're one of us. This is just a religion. If I'm sitting and I'm sure lots of people listening to this podcast will know this exact scenario. You're sitting in the company of a group of people, whether it's in work, whether it's a family event, whatever, and a conversation will start up about one of the top 5 kind of key issues that you have to be on the right side of to fit in Ireland. And some days you'll go, I'm gonna go for it. I'm gonna say something about this. And other days you say, I'm too tired, I'm not gonna bother today, and you just let the conversation go on around you and you say nothing, whatever. And there's nothing wrong with either of those things. But it comes down to the fact that the moral superiority and that your the religion of how moral you are is the new religion in Ireland. And that is why, coming back to our conversation about people like Nick Delahanty, that is why thinking for yourself in Ireland now is a radical act. It is a radical act to speak freely, to talk about things that aren't that the media or the morality police that people like Simon Harris believe in. To stand up against that, to not agree is a literal radical act now. Simon Harris and Micheál Martins and loads of other people in the political classes, in Labour, whatever, they're so certain of their rightness and their morality. It's impenetrable at this point. You can there'll be no convincing them. And that's the point I'm trying to make about elections, that there are people out there who aren't engaged, who are mildly engaged or whatever. They have to hear these other views. They have to hear. That's the whole point of Gript, is to hear other views that the morality police aren't allowing on the telly. And so, yeah, I don't think anyone's evil or going around and thinking, I'm going to do this really bad thing and I'm going to ignore these people or whatever. But I just think that people like Simon Harris have officially left the reservation. They are so far from the shore now. They have gotten so high on inhaling the fumes of moral superiority that they can't see the shore. And
but you know what I think, and in fairness, it was I will give credit where it's due. It was a conversation I had a few days ago with one of our contributors and our parents, which changed my thinking on this, which is, I think you and I and a lot of people who think things that we think make a real mistake when we call them the morality police. And we what we accuse them of essentially is trying to police our morality. And that's not what we should be accusing them of. Because not only they're not the morality police, they're the immorality police. Because what they are doing is actively wrong. It's not like, I get people who write to us about this podcast who say, you don't talk about immigration enough. Okay, well, let's talk about it. But let's talk about it in the context of morality, because let's look at the morality that's actually applied. Simon Harris and Micheál Martin and politicians of their ilk. I'm talking about those two because they are the people in power. The reason Ireland has the immigration numbers it has is because they believe it is ultimately moral for Ireland to help the less advantaged of the world, to bring in thousands and thousands and thousands of people here to offer them a better life. No, that is not what you're elected to do. The Irish government exists to promote the welfare of the Irish people. That does not mean that there is no room for compassionate immigration or for dealing with people who, in a measured way, who need our help and support and bringing them here. It does, however, mean that you don't get to shut down our entire tourist industry, pack hotels around the country to the gills with young migrant men from the third world, the majority of whom your own government now admits are economic migrants. I mean, that's not my words. Those are your words. In the government, you said you brought in a whole load of people who are economic migrants under the guise of the asylum system, and you pretend you're more moral than the rest of us. No, your morality, and go back to the Charles Dickens morality on this with Mrs. Jellyby, is to look after your own children, to look after your own country, to look after the people who to whom you answer and who pay your wages. And then for Micheál Martin, people will know, Micheál Martin has always had this thing which drives me crazy, which is that kind of patronizing, down your nose look he gives people when he's disagreeing with them, as if he's morally superior. No, he's not. He's morally inferior on this question and a whole load of others. It is not morally superior. I'll come back to the Occupied Territories Bill because I just think it's a classic example of this. You think you are more moral because you're taking on all these US senators and you're taking on the United States. And you don't care if you're going to cost loads of Irish people potentially their jobs because you're stopping a genocide. You're Mr. Moral. Well, until you're willing to pay the price yourself, because Micheál Martin and Simon Harris and their acolytes are never going to have to give up their gold-plated pensions or their jobs or their company retirements or the lifestyle to which they've been accustomed. But there are families with small kids up and down the country who rely on the jobs you have created for years with the strategy of foreign direct investment that you are now directly risking for a piece of legislation that everybody who supports it admits will make no difference one way or the other. That is not moral. That is deeply immoral. So when we talk about them as a morality police, it kind of almost concedes that these people have a moral point. No, they don't. They're a disgrace.
Well, I think as well, I mean, to your point, the morality, another element of the morality that's makes it questionable is that it's not set. So the morality, the moral point changes all the time. So to use your example, it was immoral and racist to say that somebody was economic migrant, and then later on the goalposts shift and that suddenly becomes acceptable. So they are deciding what the parameters of morality are, and they change it to suit themselves all the time. Micheál Martin, to your point, has always had a way of looking down his nose on other people who disagree with him or whatever. But I find that hilarious by somebody whose morality has completely changed multiple times during the course of his career. He was pro-life, then he was pro-choice. What he decides is moral on the day is changeable. And then he sneers at people who had the opinion that he might have had the day before. So yeah, there's absolutely no moral superiority there. And when I say that they're the morality police, or policing our morality, that's not me suggesting that they have a moral position on anything. It's actually quite the opposite. Their moral position changes every day. And the people that I respect, and I've said this on the podcast before, that there's people I respect who have morals that are actually quite different from mine. What I respect about people's morals is their lack of change, that they stay, that somebody has a moral position on X and that it doesn't change. It stays throughout their career. Somebody like Pat or Tobin, they have a position on something and they will stand in a storm around them and they will not budge on that position because that's their moral position on that thing. And your Micheál Martins and your Simon Harris is another one, leafleted his constituency at one point about how he was pro-lifer and always would be, and then ran a campaign to repeal the Eighth Amendment. These are people whose morals changed with the weather. They stick their finger out the window in the morning and say, what does the Irish Times want me to say today? Oh yeah, that's my new moral position. That's not a moral anything. That's no morals, actually. But when I say they're the morality police, what I'm trying to say is that they think that they have a position of superiority, maybe not morals, but a position of superiority, that somehow they are more enlightened than we are on key issues, and that if you don't agree with them, you just haven't evolved like they have, because they've all been on a journey for their political careers, which is just a nice way of saying that you've changed your opinions with the weather. But they've been on a journey, so they're more enlightened than us. And if we just try harder and read a few more cool books, we'll be enlightened like them someday too. That's what I'm getting at. Moral police maybe is the wrong term, but enlightenment instructors will say, whatever.
Look, just for clarity, in case it came across that way, because I recognize I've been a bit trigger happy this week when I was criticizing the term morality police. I wasn't criticizing you. I've used that term before. I've used it on several occasions. I just think it doesn't accurately describe what these people are, and I think their morality is what needs to be challenged, perhaps more aggressively. Anyway, morality is a good sticking point to move on to the third topic we were going to discuss this week, which is that obviously we've been saying for some years now, in a metaphorical way, that modern Ireland loves nothing better than digging up the past, and now we can say it literally, because this week obviously excavations began, Sarah, in Tuam, the former mother and baby home there, to uncover the alleged remains that are posted there, that are buried there, I should say, of children who lost their lives in that home over the years until it closed some 64 years ago, from 1925 to 1961. I think it was in operation.
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk about that because I remember distinctly being at a social event in the beginning of 2024, and you and I have mentioned, certainly since we've been doing this podcast, people do come up to us on the street, and mostly you're all very pleasant, 99% of the time, and then occasionally somebody comes up and challenges you and calls you a fascist or whatever, and that's just part of the job, at least for me, and you generally just nice them. This wasn't actually a stranger. This is a woman I know a little bit. And she'd had a couple of drinks, and the truth came out, and I got this spiel about, that I was a defender of what went on in Tuam. And how could I be? Even though, by the way, I don't think I'd ever written or spoken about Tuam publicly at the time. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, I will never forget the words she used. She said, the nuns slaughtered those children and threw them in the septic tank. And it stuck with me, because slaughtered is an active word. That doesn't imply children died in your care. That implies you actually killed them. And then it transpired further in the conversation that she believed that these children had actually been taken in, that the opening of a kind of live septic tank filled with human excrement was exposed, and their bodies were thrown into it to just sink and rot in the human waste. And that is what she believed. And I remember remarking at several points during, in the months after to people that this is what she believed. And lots of people said, oh yeah, loads of people believe that. That's what people believe. And it's bizarre to me because when you look at the reports of what actually happened in Tuam, it just couldn't be further from the truth. I mean, I don't think, and I think this is an indictment of the way the media cover these issues. It's not about whether the church was always right or was always wrong, because obviously no one disputes. There were some brutal nuns, there were some brutal priests. There was in general a kind of culture of callousness. What's really interesting is, for example, in the 1960s, you reports referring to the children, reports written by the state, which is a theme I'll come back to, referring to a portion of the children in that home as being in there because they were imbeciles. And that was the word that was used. Imbecile children were sent there, often by the health board. But what's really interesting, people have no idea of the context of this. So the Tuam Mother and Baby Home was first of all operated by the state. It was a Galway County Council initiative. They provided the funding every year to the nuns. It was also the case that the vast majority of children in that home were referred there, and the mothers, by the way, were referred there by the state. So people, I think, have this image of Catholic Ireland being a place where Sarah Ryan goes home to her father and says, sorry, I was out there the other night and turns out I'm pregnant, and your father will keep it secret for a little while.
The other night.
I don't know. Maybe you found the pregnancy under a cabbage there. I don't know. But you go home and you say I was pregnant, and then the next day the parish priest would come with his crozier, wrap you around the neck with it, and you'd be dragged off to the Mother and Baby Home. In actual fact, the overwhelming majority of referrals to the Tuam Home were made by the health board. It was the health board that would refer mothers and babies to this home. Secondly, thirdly, the nuns were always persistently asking for more support. So, when it comes to the dying children, there were several investigations in the 1950s as to why was the death rate abnormally high in Tuam, and all the conclusions were the same, that it was because of a lack of antenatal, that is prenatal care, that women were being brought in the week before they were due to give birth, complications, things like breech births, etc., were not being detected in time, and this was causing a high rate of postnatal mortality in children. And that, you might say, that's terrible, until you realize that 3 years before that, the nuns had implored the Galway County Council to give them funding to bring women in at 4 and 5 months of pregnancy to give them prenatal care. And the health board had said, no, we're not paying for that shit. Thanks very much. People also talk about the septic tank as if there was human excrement in it. There was no human excrement. It was empty because the facility had, for most of its existence, no running water during the day, because despite the nuns imploring the council to provide that service, they wouldn't do it. Had no functioning pumped sewage system either. And all of their records, and the state actually reported them in the Commission of Inquiry into the Mother and Baby Homes. And there's a 65-page section on the Tuam facility that is a state report. All I've done is quoted from that report and what I've just said. And people have no clue what's in it. And now they're doing this thing where they're digging up these children, most of whom were buried either in the old, admittedly brutal manner of burying an unbaptized child in unconsecrated ground, or else buried in a kind of an area in the garden that was adjacent to the septic tank. Even Catherine Corliss herself, who investigated it, I think is on the record as saying that some of the septic tank stuff is just flat wrong. And yet this is one of the most persistent myths in modern Ireland, that this new investigation, I think, is just whipping up again. And it just comes back to the previous conversation about morality, is that not content with warping the morality of the present, it often feels to me like we live in a society that is obsessed with warping the morality of the past. And it is, to that extent, I don't know if anyone else feels it in the country, if you're listening to me, it feels exceedingly totalitarian. And I don't know if you agree with me on that, or whether you think I'm saying too much, or indeed what you think of the Tuam excavation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know as much about it as you do, and while you're talking, I'm kind of getting, I suppose, nervous is kind of the strong word, but a little bit nervous for you on the reaction people will have to what they will interpret as you defending the indefensible, and this happened, and it fits in with a narrative that people believe about what Ireland was like. And again, like you said, it's not to say that there's not there wasn't lots of horrific things done and lots of huge issues with the Catholic Church and the way Ireland was run in those days, but there is an unwillingness to accept. I have people that I know who are friends who are a lot older, but who in their younger years, probably 40, 50 years ago, were nurses, and they would say that hospitals were run better by nurses than they ever were since, that ward sisters, and they were clean and
By
everything.
nuns, I mean.
By nuns, sorry. And it almost feels again like a radical act to say, well, there are priests who did really amazing community work and were the center of their communities and were beloved by their entire community and did amazing things and were wonderful. And there were schools that were run really well and that not everything was bad. It feels like a radical act to admit that. But that's the Ireland we're in now. It's intertwined to what we're talking about, which is there are things that are morally acceptable, positions that you take, and deviating from those positions is not acceptable. So when you're talking about this, I haven't read this report. A lot of this is, I'm hearing it for you for the first time, but it still feels little bit nerve-wracking to start saying this, because people will start saying, there's John McGurk, well-known conservative, Bible-bashing religious fanatic who's just defending the church again.
I got a very funny DM this week from a woman who I know quite well. And so she's at this social event and she DMs me quite late in the evening and just 4 words, or is it 5 words? Are you an Opus Dei? ? And I just replied, what on earth to make you think I was an Opus Dei? She said, no, I was talking to somebody at this social event and they said you were definitely an Opus Dei.
Oh my God.
It's nice to be a topic of conversation anywhere, whatever the circumstances are. And secondly, no, I'm absolutely not in Opus Dei. In fact, I'm not even a mass goer. I'm not a religious person at all in any way, shape, or form. But coming back to this point about you being nervous for me because of what the reaction might be to this, like, I do not dispute, nor should anybody, that in general, social life in the past was probably not as free as it is today, and that in many ways Ireland, under the thrall of hardline Catholicism, was an unpleasant place to live for many, many people. It was certainly an unpleasant place to be gay. Very difficult place. I think there were sexual double standards. One of the things that's really interesting in the report, by the way, is the fact that many of the young women admitted to the home, there were attempts made to recover support payments from fathers, but the fathers seem in most cases to have gotten away with it. That the women always paid the price and the men got away with it, which I think sadly has always been the case. And I'm not sure the sexual revolution has done much to advance that. But at the same time, acknowledging that there were really bad things that happened in the past, including sexual abuse scandals in the church, is different from Ireland's obsession with making the past into kind of a trademarked oppression from which we have recently escaped and must now be liberated. Like Ireland in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, there were elements of it that were bad. But to listen to some of the people who run this country today, you would think it was the upside down. You'd think it was a place where like women were routinely taken out and subjected to the rack, or that people were beaten left, right, and center. The fact is that we emphasize these things not because we think that the past should be a brilliant place, but because we want to legitimize what's happening today. So there is a political reason, and has been for years, for constantly doing documentaries on, let's do another documentary on the oppression of women in some Magdalen laundry in Wexford. And let's do another film about a woman being savagely attacked in the years of the Catholic Church. It is not about art. It's about politics. It is about trying to indoctrinate a generation with hatred of their own past in order to remake them into a new progressive future. And I think it should be resisted, because the truth of the matter, what we should be angry about is not that we shouldn't be angry about what happened in Tuam. It's that we should be angry at the right people. What has happened here is that the state has basically transferred all of the blame for the institutional policy of the state in the 1950s onto this little group of nuns, who were, in the words of the report, words of a report from the 1950s that investigated and said, the nuns are not to blame here for the standard of care. They're providing excellent food and excellent care, but the state is not supporting them. That was a state report in the 1950s that said that. And was it actioned? No. But here comes the state 50 years later to go, those dastardly nuns, look what they did to those kids. And here comes a media that is so intent on whipping up hysteria around this that there are middle-class professional women in this country of high levels of intelligence who will turn around to me having had a couple of glasses of wine and sincerely believe that these nuns were strangling babies and throwing them in shit. Like, that kind of belief system doesn't happen by an accident. That only happens after a sustained campaign of relentless, deliberate, deceptive, and malevolent propaganda. And the victims of it in many, many cases have been innocent people in religious orders who've only tried to live a life of good. They've also been victims, by the way, of some of the horrible people in their own orders, but many of these people have been victims of it. And the other victims are people who are genuinely interested in their own country's history, who get the fairy tale version of it. And I mean, isn't it, if I'm a critic of my own country, sometimes people say, you're a West Brit, you don't like your own country. I don't like the way we conduct ourselves in this country. I do not like the greatest victims in history tag. Nothing as bad in this country has ever been done by us. It's always some external actor. It was the Catholic Church. They did it to us. The European Union, they did it to us. The Brits, they did it to us. The Normans, they did it to us. Sometimes we have been very, 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 very capable of making an absolute monstrosity out of ourselves and doing damage to our own people. But the victim complex, that is what is nothing to do with the flag, nothing to do with our history, nothing to do with the country being independent. But what really bugs me is the victim complex. You want to be an alpha society, stand up and take ownership of your shit. You don't see Americans sitting around kind of going, oh, yeah, somebody else did slavery to us. No, they did it themselves. Well, we did as a society to ourselves a lot of what happened in those laundries.
I think that what you're describing, though, is a real, what I would say is a really kind of post-colonial thing. You know, it's always the other. There's us and them. This has been imposed upon us. This has been done to us. And I think that the society that you're talking about in those days in Ireland, that, as we have already acknowledged, but I will again, the Catholic Church did really horrible things and made Ireland, to a large degree, not a nice place to grow up or to live in if you were gay or if you were an unmarried mother or, you know, lots of other things.
Yeah, but can I just challenge you briefly?
No, hold on. I'm getting to and sexual abuse of children was going on or whatever. But what you don't hear about acknowledged a lot is it's so easy to say that and then finish the sentence and not say that the Catholic Church was aided and abetted in many ways by us, by curtain twitchers and people talking about each other and ratting on each other and people throwing out their daughter who was pregnant and sending her off somewhere else because they were so ashamed of her, and people like what's the word, kicking their children out for being gay, and interfamily sexual abuse. Loads and loads and loads of interfamily sexual abuse was happening at those times. Horrible stuff was happening in families. People were doing horrible stuff. Things that we now would say, I couldn't imagine that you would cast out your child for being pregnant or for being gay or whatever. But we did that too. And all we have to talk about is blaming the church. But it was us too. We did it.
Yeah, we know. By the way, the thing that's always said back in reaction to what you've just said, by the way, that because I've written several pieces on this over the years, and people always say to me, "Oh, well, the families felt that they had to throw the daughter out." It's shite, and the reason we know it's shite is that a very significant proportion of families didn't do it.
Yeah,
very significant portion of families did not do it. A very significant portion of families in the society kept their daughters and looked after them and had the kids on their home. Now, I'm not making judgments on those families or anyone else who made those decisions, because maybe there are economic factors involved. But the idea that it was kind of a church decree, bullshit. And the thing I was going to challenge you on, by the way, was it's another thing. It's like the morality police, where we've trained ourselves into this business of, you know, you've said it on this podcast, and I actually think I said it earlier on. Of course we accept the Catholic Church did bad things. I mean, why don't we say that about other institutions? I mean, earlier on in the week we had the story about George Gibney, the former swimming coach, arrested over in Florida, now being extradited back home to Ireland. Why don't we say, you know, the Acme Swimming Corporation did bad things, or whatever the name of that organization is? Why don't we say it about all that? We have a new sex investigation into schools. A lot of them had lay teachers. Why don't we say, and of course the schools did bad things? Well, of course, some of them are run by the church, right? But a lot of the people suspected of abuse were not members of the church, just regular civilians.
Well,
Like, it is.
well, it's because that's, I mean, what you're describing there goes back to the point from earlier on, which is that you have that in you because that's our culture. I was saying earlier on, you're some people who listen to this podcast, you're in the company of people. Sometimes they'll be talking about the issue. You have a different view. Sometimes you go for it. Sometimes you don't. But you definitely still have to say there's a in order to make the other person, I always say, sometimes I feel like in Ireland that you have to kind of comfort and fluff up the other person before you say scary things that might offend them or might be disagreeable to their thing. So you have to say, well, of course, obviously, X, Y, and Z, Donald Trump is a terrible person, but because that'll make them feel at ease. And then you can sneak a little, maybe questionable opinion in there under the radar after you've softened them up with the obvious, like, relaxation point. It's that you have to, we are conditioned to feel like you have to say the grounding statement in order to make people even slightly open to hearing what you say after that. So you have to say, of course, the Catholic Church did terrible things, but because that levels the playing field so people will listen to you. If you don't comfort them, they won't be able to listen. La, 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 la. Of course, Donald Trump is a terrible person, but maybe he's right about the trans thing. Because if you don't say that, then they just won't, they won't know you're one of them. They won't know. And they'll be scared because you're doing the radical thing of expressing a different opinion. That's
All right.
a symptom of what you're talking about.
All right. Well, look, we have sadly run out of time. I mean, actually, it's a funny thing because we don't actually have a time limit. It's a podcast. We could talk for 3 more hours, couldn't we? But then you'd get bored of us. So we like to keep it to around about an hour. We've gone slightly over. Thank you very much for listening and putting up to us. A podcast of kind of two halves. I think you had the very sedate opening with the presidential election, and then I kind of
You
lost my
went on a
shit
mad
halfway
one then.
through.
You went on
Yeah,
a mad
yeah.
one.
Well,
Yeah.
who knows? Well, it's there's something for everybody in there, isn't there? So listen, thank you very much for listening to us. We hope that you have an enjoyable final. It's not the final week in July, but it's close to. We hope we're having a good summer wherever you're listening to us. We'll be back next week for another edition of the week that we do. As I've been John, she's been Sarah. This has been fun, and we'll talk to you next week. Take care. Bye.